I'll be presenting a criminal profile of the offenders involved in the Oakwood Community Center attack, a case that reflects patterns seen in religious extremist homicide. So let's begin by looking at the details of the attack itself. So on August 30th, 2024, four masked male offenders disrupted an interfaith event at the Oakwood Community Center using semi-auto handguns and home explosives. Three people were killed, 10 injured. The offenders left graffiti reading White Warriors and had sent prior threats by email. Police believe this group is also linked to prior attacks on a pride event and a police brutality sit-in, suggesting an ideological pattern of violence. Religious extremist homicide is motivated by a perceived need to defend or promote religious worldview. It often involves targeting symbols of multiculturalism and inclusion. As Boehm notes, radicalization is a gradual process shaped by grievance, ideology, and group dynamics. We can see these elements clearly reflected in this case. Before we move into specific offender profile, it is important to understand the broader crime type behind this attack, religious extremist homicide. This type of violence is typically driven by a mindset of religious exclusivity, the belief that one's own religion is the only valid path, and that other groups or identities are dangerous and illegitimate. As Kamenowski emphasized, this exclusivity fuels hostility towards multiculturalism and inclusive events like the one targeted at Oakwood. Additionally, as Boehm explains, radicalization into violent extremism is not sudden, it's a gradual process. Offenders become increasingly committed to violence over time through a combination of grievance, ideological reinforcement, and group of dynamics. In this case, we clearly see signs of both factors at work, religious exclusivity and a progressive radicalization process, shaping the offender's motivation and choice of target. Now that we've seen the broader context of this crime type, let's turn to the likely profile of offenders themselves, starting with their socio-demographic life habits. So, based on the patterns found in the cases of far-right religious extremist violence, these offenders are likely white males in their 20s to early 30s. They often socially isolated, unmarried, and have few close ties close ties, which is a pattern strongly supported by both Fredlich and Kamenowski's research. This isolation often makes them more vulnerable to online radicalization and extremist narratives. It is also likely that these individuals are regular consumers of extremist content, such as online forums, hate websites, or digital manifestos. In this case, the pre-attack email threats shows clear signs of ideological messaging, which aligns with this pattern. Additionally, there is a strong chance that they have a history of connections to hate groups, whether formal memberships or informal online communities. And finally, a key driver behind their worldview is religious exclusivity, the belief that their religion is the only legitimate one, and that interfaith or multicultural events pose a threat. Together, the socio-demographic factors provide a strong foundation for understanding who those offenders are likely to be and how they arrive in this act of violence. As Fredlich noted, this hostility drives their targeting of inclusive community events like the interfaith gathering attack here. Secondly, many show narcissism and rigid thinking, believe their ideology is the only valid truth. This makes them resistant to alternative viewpoints and fuels an us versus them mindset. Third, these offenders often exhibit obsessive tendencies, with their identity deeply tied to their ideology. They may spend excessive time consuming and reinforcing extremist narratives, especially in online echo chambers. A key factor is their strong sense of perceived injustice. As Shawarki points out, these feelings can fuel radicalization, convincing offenders that violence is a justified response to these perceived wrongs. Finally, Bowen reminds us that radicalization is a gradual process. It is shaped by the interaction of grievance, ideology, and group dynamics, all of which combine to move individuals further towards violence. We can clearly see this process reflect in this case through the prior email threats, ideological graffiti, and symbolic targeting. Now let's examine how these psychological factors are expressed through offenders' behaviors and modus operandi. First, they engage in clear pre-attack surveillance and communication. We know the event organizers received threatening emails signed white words in advance, which indicates both premeditation and a desire to instill fear. Secondly, the offenders executed a coordinated early arrival and armed entry. They entered the building well before the event began and used semi-automatic handguns and homemade explosives, which suggests a degree of technical preparation and planning. Third, the choice of target. The interfaith event shows symbolic targeting. This is a consistent this is consistent with religious extremist homicide patterns, which offenders seek to attack symbols of multiculturalism and religious tolerance. Finally, the offenders left ideological graffiti, the phrase white warriors, and engaged in chanting during the attack. As Turvey notes, these types of signature behavior serves an emotional or ideological need beyond the tactical goals of crime. They are desired to send a clear message to both victims and the broader public. Next, let's look at the geographic patterns of these crimes and what they can tell us about the offender's movement and planning. All three known attacks, the Oakwood Community Center, the Pride event, and the police brutality sit-in occurred in neighboring urban and suburban areas. This clustering suggests that offenders are operating within a comfort zone, an area they know well and can navigate with confidence. This pattern fits closely to Rossmo's theory of geographic profiling. According to Rossmo, offenders typically avoid targeting locations too close to their home base to reduce the risk of detection, but also avoid traveling too far, which increases logistical complexity. This mid-range activity zone, known as the buffer zone, is exactly what we see here. Additionally, the offenders demonstrate a clear familiarity with local escape routes. In the Oakwood attack, they fled through a nearby forest area. This suggests prior surveillance and planning, not random targeting. We can also apply routine theory here. The offenders are likely to select soft targets, public events in open spaces with limited security, which they could maximize symbolic impacts and minimize the chance of being stopped. So finally, let's look at some investigative techniques that can help law enforcement departments to identify these offenders and prevent further attacks. First, the investigators should apply linkage analysis across all three incidents, the Oakwood attack, the Pride event, and the police sit-in. By, by analyzing the common patterns in modus operandi, signature behaviors, and pre-attack communication, police can strengthen the case that these crimes are connected. Secondly, geographic profiling is a critical tool here as well. By mapping the spatial pattern of these attacks, analysis can identify likely zones of offender activity, helping to narrow surveillance and investigative efforts. Third, digital forensic analysis should be prioritized. The offenders send threatening emails before open attack. This creates potential lead to IP tracing, metadata analysis, and digital behavior patterns. Given their online radicalization, their digital footprint could be key to identify them. Finally, community intelligence gathering can provide valuable insights. As Shawarki emphasized, building trust with local communities is essential, both to encourage tips and to disrupt radicalization pathways. In cases like this, local knowledge and observations often yield leads forensics or digital tools alone may miss. To summarize, here's the offender's profile we can draw from this case and the research literature. This is likely the likely offenders are white males in their early adulthoods, most likely in their 20s and 30s, and they are likely socially isolated, unmarried, and have few strong social ties. This isolation often drives them to seek identity and belonging through extremist online communities. They have likely undergone a gradual process of radicalization shaped by grievance ideology and group dynamics, as described as ballroom. Their belief system is driven by religious exclusivity, making them deeply hostile towards multiculturalism and inclusive events. Their behavior indicates from pre-attack surveillance and threatening emails to coordinated with armed entry to ideological graffiti demonstrates high control and deliberate planning. Finally, based on these patterns and their ideology, it's likely that this group will reoffend unless apprehended. Their actions show a clear trajectory towards continuous symbolic violence and making proactive intervention critical. This profile, supported by peer-reviewed research and criminological theory, can provide valuable guidance for law enforcement as they work to identify and disrupt this offender group. And this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for watching.